Hello, and welcome to the When Depression is in Your Bed podcast. Today, I will share with you some of my love story, some of the things that led to my husband and I getting together and falling in love in the first place, as well as some of the things that contributed to it all falling apart. And of course, I will share with you some of the lessons that we learned along the way. Let's get started. So while I have been referencing little bits and pieces of my life over the last 6 episodes, I wanted to take today's episode just to be able to start to tell you a little bit more about what I call my love story, which is the story of how my husband, Ben, and I came together and fell in love and what our early relationship looked like. That sort of set the stage for me choosing to stay in a 20-year long and still going strong relationship that has really been really hard most of the time. So I've also said before that I will be sharing about my story, and the story I'm about to share has to do with many, many other people. And I'm going to be very respectful of the fact that I have chosen to start this podcast and not everybody in my story has chosen to start their own podcast, sharing their own personal lives and information. So I will give you a very intentionally vague view of some of the family history factors, childhood factors that sort of set Ben and I up to be who we are and really be such a match for each other in this way, to be such of what I would call an Imago match. And I'm an Imago Relationship Therapist. And very soon in one of the upcoming episodes, I will dive more into Imago theory, which has been absolutely life-changing for me. But for today, what an Imago match means essentially is it's the person who has just the right collection of positive and negative characteristics that you experienced from your childhood. So essentially, it's the good, the bad, and everything in between of your early caregivers. For many of us, that means mom and dad, but it can be any collection of parents or parental figures or important adults or even older siblings in your life that had an influence on who you were and who you saw yourself to be and eventually who you grew up to become. And so our Imago match is very special because this just right combination of characteristics in somebody else allows us to be essentially triggered in just the right ways so that we can actually come to conflicts that happen in our romantic partnership in a way that helps us heal and grow and finish the unfinished business of our childhood experience, meaning that in our childhood, all of us, even if you had the most loving, most well-intentioned parents, we were hurt in the context of relationship because no parent or caregiver can be 100% exactly what we need them to be all of the time. And so we came away from certain experiences feeling hurt or disappointed or whatever we felt, and we take that into our adult life. Again, I will pause here for the theory a little bit, but just to say that there are important pieces of my childhood and Ben's childhood experience that led us to be who we are today, but because they involve so many other people, I will not so publicly share them, but I will give you a little taste. So for me, my parents were separated when I was about 16 years old and divorced a few years later. And at the ripe old age of 19, I was surprised by my parents' divorce. I hadn't seen it coming, although now as an adult looking back, it's very clear what happened. But as I was making sense of it as a young adult, the way that I saw it was that my parents function match. That's what I sort of called it back then. Kind of like the things they did well sort of complemented each other in certain ways. And that's why they got together in the first place. And that's what kept them together. And they were together for over 20 years. But I came to see also, as much as their function matched, that what I called then their dysfunction matched, which meant to me that there were things about both of them that caused conflict. And those conflicts either felt insurmountable or they didn't have the tools or the resources at the time, or perhaps from many years of trying, they didn't have the desire or just didn't make sense for them anymore to continue on, and they ended up getting divorced. And that was a very difficult experience for me, and that combined with many other aspects of my childhood experience sort of led me to a place in my dating life You could sort of say that I was looking for love in all the wrong places. And I did not have a history of very stellar relationships. I had a history of pretty rocky, very difficult relationships. When I met Ben, we were both 24 years old. I had not been seriously dating for a little while because of my past history, actually. And I decided to go on Match.com, which back then was so bizarre and so weird. And people were terrified that I was going to meet an axe murderer or something. And they said things like, make sure you meet in public places. And they would want me to tell them where we were meeting and what time, just in case I disappeared off the face of the earth. They knew where to tell the cops that I was at last. But the reason I went on Match.com is because at that time in my life, I was living in Greenwich Village and I was going to graduate school for my master's of social work. And when I had come into the city, I had really thought that I was going to really find my people. I thought being in social work school, I was going to find these passionate people who wanted to change the world for the better. And I do think that those people existed in my school. I just think that I found that being in graduate school, a lot of us had jobs and we had internships and we had really busy lives. And so for me, particularly as someone who lived with depression, while I'm not socially anxious, meaning I don't feel anxiety in large groups of people, the fear of being judged doesn't shut me down necessarily, but connecting with people can sometimes be very difficult for me because I can be in that dorsal state that I've talked about through the lens of polyvagal theory, where I'm sort of hiding and it feels safer to kind of be in the background. Now, for people who know me, they find that to be actually quite hysterical because I have a tendency to talk a lot. Making a podcast was not such a leap for me, but it depends what situations I'm in and who I'm with. And my ability to talk a lot does not always mean, as a matter of fact, it often doesn't translate to me being able to connect well. So sometimes I can be too talkative, that makes connection difficult. And other times I can be actually almost silent, which also makes connection really difficult. So when I found myself in graduate school with a bunch of very busy people, I had a very hard time connecting with anybody. And luckily, as I've mentioned before, I had cousins who lived in the area, so I was able to see them. But my friends who I had grown up with and had gone to college with, they didn't live too far. They lived just on the other side of the bridge in New Jersey, but it just wasn't always easy or convenient for them to come into the city or for me to get back home and see them. So it's not that I was in complete and total isolation, but my day-to-day life was definitely lonelier than I expected it to be moving to the city, which I love New York City, and I was raised in Queens and I feel very connected to the city. And so I was really expecting it to be a wonderful experience for me. And when I got there, it really wasn't. So that's a little bit about where I was when I decided to go on Match.com. I was really looking for friends or anybody that I could just spend some time with, in addition to my cousins who I luckily had available to me. And so for Ben, I'm going to hold off on his childhood introduction for when he actually comes on and can speak for himself. I think that it is just a more honoring way for him to tell his story than for me to tell his story for him. But just like all of us, he had his own childhood experiences, his own early experiences that shaped him and led him to New York City. He traveled in what I think is an interesting path to get to New York City, because whereas I was born in New York and had moved to New Jersey in late elementary school and was very connected to New York, I wasn't far from home by any stretch. But Ben actually was raised in Maryland and he had gone to school up in Boston, and he had come to live in New York City because at the time he had come to New York for work opportunities to work with certain people that he really wanted to work with. And actually, by the time I met him, he was already going through a career change. He'd been doing audio engineering for a few years and had had some success with it and had decided to shift gears because of the very hectic schedule and very unpredictable hours of work. And he had shifted into IT. So I actually met him right at his shift in career. He had gone on Match.com at that time for his own reasons, because his childhood friends did not live in New York City. His college college friends did not live in New York City. And the friends and colleagues he had in the music industry, although they were still there, they were still working the same unpredictable sort of crazy hours that came with that line of work. And so he was feeling lonely himself. And of course, also a long history of depression and his own, I'll call them maybe challenges with connection, led him to choose to go on Match.com as well, so that he, as his profile said, could find cool people to do cool things with in New York City. I wasn't on Match.com for very long. I don't think either of us were on it for very long. I had gone on a couple of dates, I think maybe 3 or 4 dates before meeting Ben, actually. They were only all first dates. They were perfectly fine, but they weren't people that I necessarily wanted to be friends with, and they also weren't necessarily people that I wanted to date. So they all fizzled out pretty quickly. But then I met Ben, and my relationship with him started off really strong right off the bat. Back then, after moving off of the Match.com chat, we went to chatting on AOL Instant Messenger, if you remember, for those of you who remember that. And I was in the end of my semester in school, so I had a lot of different papers to write. And he would message me, and I would say, I'm writing a paper. And then he would message me at some other point, and I'd be like, I'm writing a paper. And it kind of went on like this. And at one point he said, hey, that must really be one amazing paper because you're working on it around the clock. And I thought that was really funny because I had many different papers that I was working on. And I told him so, but he was very sweet because this spanned over several weeks, and I kept trying to give the message, like, I do want to connect. I'm just busy at the moment, which, by the way, is a huge theme in my life even today. It's a major barrier that I have to connection in general, and it's kind of something that I live with. And the people who are in my life now, and of course Ben, but I mean other people, friends, and even family, if they're in my life, they kind of unfortunately have to know, or I imagine they have to know, that I love them even though I sometimes go dark. I get overwhelmed, I get busy, I'm trying to do a lot of things, and I just have a very hard time managing my social connections in addition to the to-dos in my life. So anyhow, that's a whole other episode, another day, but it's been like that my entire life. So I was really grateful that even though I kept saying, hey, I'm busy, but I was also saying, like, message me later, or, as soon as I'm done with my semester, like, I'll be able to chat more. So he didn't take it personally, and he hung in there for those several weeks, and I just thought it was really sweet. And he would just send me cute little funny messages, and he wasn't pressuring, he wasn't gross, he wasn't sending me, like sexually charged, unsolicited messages or anything like that. Like, he was just really sweet and seemed really kind. So after my semester was over, we decided to finally meet for the first time. And so we did. I will let Ben tell you his version of the story at some other time, perhaps. We have slightly different stories. He says that I was running very late and he was going to leave the first date. I don't recall running as late as he remembers, but that has also been a lifelong challenge for us because I have a tendency to run just on time, which often makes me run a little bit behind schedule. And he's the kind of person that would rather be there 3 hours early than a minute late. Very common relational challenge dynamic right there, by the way. But I did show up, and in our very first conversation, we talked about how I was a cat person and he was a dog person, which was so interesting. It was a funny, silly conversation then, although true, but it really set the stage for our entire lives and our whole relationship, and the idea of being an Imago match, that a lot of the time Imago matches have qualities that are very different, very opposing, or very opposite. And so the fact I was a cat person, he was a dog person, shows up in many, many, many ways throughout the whole rest of our lives. But we enjoyed each other and we had a very nice time, and our coffee date actually turned into 9 hours of hanging out together. And we went to Washington Square Park, and we went to Grand Central Station because I told him I'd never been there before, and he couldn't believe that I'd grown up in New York and I'd never been to Grand Central Station before. So we went there, and we went to dinner eventually, and then I walked him to the subway to say goodnight, and I can't say for certain, maybe we hugged, we might have just shook hands, but there was no goodnight kiss, that I can tell you. And we started dating, the details of which maybe I'll share another time, but we did eventually start dating exclusively. And I've referred to this before, but we had what I call the summer of love. We had met in May for the first time, and because he was going through this career change, he actually was finishing up his IT certification, and I was taking some summer class, but it was a light caseload. And so we had this little window of time before he ended up starting his new IT job in September. So we had these few months where we really got to have this connected, almost no stress, no real world stresses going on in our life. And it was just beautiful. And neither of us were depressed and neither of us were stressed. And I would say that we were just our authentic, true selves. And we got to know each other and it was really delightful. I felt really important and I felt really special, and he was way different than the guys I had previously dated. And I was pretty all in after what I call the summer of love. And then once he started his new job, which was for a very high stress startup company, things started to change pretty much overnight. And so I started to see a different experience of Ben, stressed out Ben, and through a polyvagal lens, I got to see him in survival mode a lot more of the time. He was either in that fight or flight mode of sympathetic when he was super busy with work, and he would get up all hours of the night when they needed him to do whatever they needed him to do. He was in IT, so he had things that went wrong or work he had to do in the middle of the night sometimes. And he was either, kind of like there's like fires everywhere and I have to put them out constantly. And so he was like super stressed and really overwhelmed with work, but doing it and making it all happen. And his energy was really being exhausted on that. Or he would be depressed and shut down, particularly if we had had an argument or a conflict, usually about me feeling that I was now less important than his job. I had felt so important and so valued in that summer of love that when he started spending so much time at work, I really felt very unimportant and very unloved. And so we really started to have this very challenging relationship dynamic. And in Imago theory, that I'll talk to you more about in an upcoming episode, I took on what we lovingly call the octopus role, or the maximizer role, of really reaching out, trying to talk and problem solve and, address the issues. And he took on in Imago what we lovingly call the turtle, and he would withdraw and shut down. And there were so many nights when I was awake, crying, upset, or maybe numbed out watching Law & Order SVU Special Victims Unit, which I used to watch a lot back then. And he'd be in bed sleeping because he would just shut down after an argument and he would just go soundly to sleep. And I couldn't sleep because I was wound up. Now, from a polyvagal perspective, I was in a sympathetic state, a fight or flight response, a fix response, like I have to fix this, I have to do something about this. And he was in a dorsal response, which was I have more safety in shutting down and withdrawing than facing this thing that I don't know how to face. So we kind of stayed in that dynamic really for most of our lives, honestly. I mean, things got better and worse at certain points, and we learned different things that were helpful a bit here and there along the way. And we did absolutely get back to places where we were both, in polyvagal terms, I would say we were both in ventral, we were both in regulated states, we were feeling grounded, connected, safe. And my octopus tendencies, his turtle tendencies would ease, and he would stick his head out of his shell and my tentacles would relax. And, we would certainly be able to have little glimmers of that summer of love. And so I knew that we still had what we had in the beginning, but we had it a teeny tiny amount of the time. There was a lot of very challenging times for us. And again, we both had this really long history of depression. And in our early days, we both felt, in Imago, we call it joyful aliveness, and that is such an excellent description of what we had during that early romantic love phase in our relationship. We had absolute joyful aliveness. We had this true connection. We both felt seen and heard and cared for and understood and important and worthy and secure and safe, and it was really glorious. And when we lost that, it was extremely painful. In Imago, we call that the power struggle, and we were really stuck in the power struggle a lot of the time. In polyvagal, we would say we were dysregulated a lot of the time, a significant amount of the time, a huge amount of the time. Yet when we were able to get back to a place of regulation, back to a place of safety, back to a place of connection, it was as wonderful as it had always been. And so we really fluctuated between huge amounts of power struggle and dysregulation and rather small slivers of regulated, connected, pleasant, lovable, enjoyable, wonderful space up until the time we ended up getting engaged, which was 5 years into our relationship. I definitely can talk more about, and will talk more more about what led to us separating, it feels like it makes more sense to have that part of the conversation with Ben. So maybe I will invite him. I mean, he's already been invited and is interested in joining the podcast, but maybe I will invite him specifically to talk about that part of the relationship as his introductory episode onto the podcast for his first co-host experience. But for now, I will sort of pause on that place so that I can explore that further with Ben. But just to say that we were just like my parents. Again, when I was 19, I used the words function and dysfunction. I wouldn't use function and dysfunction anymore. Now I have a much deeper understanding of the unconscious forces that attract us in relationship and how the things that we most long for in our relationship are often the things that are hardest for our partner to give us. And that's because it's actually connected to our childhood unmet needs. And it's also connected to, in Imago, what we call lost parts, which means that there are characteristics that our partner lost access to. And what we need from them is usually a direct link to the parts that they kind of gave up or lost. I will talk more about that, but now I have a much more rich understanding of those dynamics. But it really was so very similar. The details were different, but it was very similar to my parents' experience. And I think very similar to many people's experience in relationship, that when we first meet somebody, there is usually this period of time, in Imago we call it romantic love, where we feel so complete, so whole, so seen, so in alignment, like this is my other half, this is my perfect person, where have you been all my life? And there's this really delicious, fun, exciting period where it feels like we could want for nothing, like just being together is all we'll ever need, and they have everything that we need and we have everything that they need, and we're just two peas in a happy little pod. And that's a really delightful time in relationship. And most people have some period of romantic love. We say in Imago that can last anywhere between 2 hours and 18 months generally. And I would say usually it lasts for probably 3 to 6 months in most relationships. For Ben and I actually could go back. I have a journal from those very early days, and I probably could pinpoint exactly when the power struggle hit in for us. But it was probably around the 3 or 4 month mark, I would guess. And for many years, I used to say to Ben that I love the real Ben. And he would get really offended by that, which I thought it was a really lovely thing to tell somebody, like, I love the real you. But what I was really saying was like this sort of person that I didn't know and didn't particularly like a lot of the time, quite honestly, was not the real Ben. And he was like, well, this is who I am. Like, what do you mean? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, this is the real me. And now, again, through a polyvagal lens, there's such beautiful language around like when Ben is regulated, he is, of course, we're both imperfect humans, but he is just very much the person that I love being with. I really like him as a person. I think he's really wonderful and funny and intelligent and interesting, and I just like being around him. I just like being with him, and I love sharing our lives together. However, when he's dysregulated, and sometimes that looks like that sympathetic, busy at work, kind of chaotic, overwhelmed part, which is challenging to be around, or that depressive experience of being shut down, collapsed. And again, I think that it feels most honoring to talk about some of Ben's depressive episodes with Ben present so that I have full consent over what makes sense for him to say, because he'll be saying it, not me. But the story I tell myself at this point in our lives is that, I think that I could say this for both of us, we have both grown a lot in our depression and our relationship to our depression and our relationship to each other, and we've learned a lot along the way, and we are both in such a different place than we've ever been before, and it's been such an incredibly rewarding journey. It's also been a very hard and long journey, and if I had known 20 years ago the things that I know now, it still would have been challenging for sure, because healing and growth journeys are in fact challenging at parts along the way. But I think that it would have been a shorter journey in a lot of places. I don't regret it because I couldn't have known then what I know now. But what I can do is be able to share what I have learned with others. And that's why I'm here with you today. So I hope you enjoyed hearing just a little bit more about my love story with Ben. And I look forward to having Ben come on and co-host with me so I can share more with you about our relationship. And I will continue to share my learnings and the pearls of wisdom that I have come across along my path so that you too can grow and heal in a way that makes sense for you and your relationship, so that you can come to a place in your life that feels much, much better than those really hard, struggling parts. As our time comes to a close, I ask you to keep listening for just a few more moments because I want to thank you for showing up today, and I want to leave you with an invitation as you hit stop and move back out into the world on your own unique wellness journey. In order to move from where you are today to the place where you want to be, the path may seem long or unclear or unknown. And I want you to know that if that seems scary or daunting or downright terrifying or anything else, that is totally okay. Know that you do not have to create the whole way all at once. We don't travel a whole journey in one stride. And that is why my invitation to you today is to take a step, just one. Any type, any size, in any direction. It can be an external step that can be observed or measured, or it could be a step you visualize taking in your mind. It can be a step towards action or towards rest or connection or self-care or whatever step makes sense to you. I invite you to take a step today because getting to a place that feels better, more joyful, more connected than the place where you are today is possible for everyone, including you, and even when depression is in your bed. If today's episode resonated with you, please subscribe so you can be notified when each weekly episode gets released. I encourage you to leave a review and reach out to me on social media at trish.sanders.lcsw. Your feedback will help guide future episodes, and I love hearing from you. Also, please share this podcast with anyone who you think may be interested or who may get something from what I have shared. Until the next time we connect, take care of yourself and take a step.